Many of them participated this morning in Boubou-Dioulasso in a march to show their solidarity with the FDS and VDP engaged in reclaiming the territory.
Let me tell you what Ibrahim Traoré is doing. He has got agricultural projects. Burkina Faso is having a farming boom right now because of this great African leader.
Started as diplomatic tensions between the United States and a small West African nation has now exploded into massive street protests across American cities. From Times Square in New York to demonstrations in major metropolitan areas, thousands of African diaspora communities have taken to the streets in support of Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré, and their message is clear: hands off Africa. But these are not regular protests. These demonstrations have sparked heated debates about American foreign policy, neo-colonialism, and the growing influence of African military leaders who are challenging Western powers. And the reactions from both supporters and critics have been nothing short of explosive. What do you call it when American citizens take to the streets of New York, Washington, and Chicago? Not to protest something happening in America, but to defend a 36-year-old soldier who seized power in one of the world's poorest countries. Is it patriotism, foreign interference, or something entirely new that nobody saw coming? This is just the beginning of something much bigger. Before we continue, hit that like button to support our video. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a 36-year-old military officer, seized power in Burkina Faso through a coup in September 2022. Since then, he has become something of a folk hero across Africa and among African diaspora communities worldwide. But his rise to prominence has put him directly at odds with Western powers, particularly the United States and France. This situation reached a boiling point in late April 2025, when American officials made what many interpreted as veiled threats against Traoré's government. The response was swift and unprecedented. Coordinated protests erupted across multiple continents, with some of the largest demonstrations taking place right in the United States. But who is Ibrahim Traoré, and why has he captured the imagination of so many people across the African diaspora? Traoré came to power in Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation in West Africa, during a period of intense political instability. The country had been struggling with Islamic insurgency, economic challenges, and what many saw as ineffective governance under the previous regime. When Traoré and his fellow military officers took control, they promised to prioritize national sovereignty and fight against what they called neo-colonial influence. However, unlike many military leaders who seize power and simply enrich themselves, Traoré began implementing policies that directly challenged Western interests in the region. His government expelled French military forces, ended partnerships with international mining companies that many locals felt were exploiting their natural resources, and began forging closer ties with Russia and China. This shift did not go unnoticed in Washington. American officials, particularly those involved in African policy, began expressing concerns about Burkina Faso's new direction. The situation escalated when reports emerged of an alleged coup plot against Traoré's government, with some suggesting Western backing for the attempt. But the breaking point came when American officials made public statements that many interpreted as threats against Traoré's leadership. People have argued about what the statements really meant, but the impact was immediate and powerful. On April 3, 2025, unexpected coordinated protests erupted across multiple continents in support of Ibrahim Traoré and against what demonstrators called Western interference in African affairs. But the most surprising and significant of these protests took place in the United States. The centerpiece of the American demonstrations was a massive rally in New York City's Times Square. Thousands of people gathered in Manhattan's most iconic location, marching through the streets with placards supporting Traoré and condemning what they saw as American interference in African affairs. The scene was remarkable. In the heart of America's most famous commercial district, protesters chanted slogans like "Hands off Africa," "Stop neo-colonialism," and "Long live Captain Traoré." Many carried Burkina Faso flags alongside signs denouncing American foreign policy. But the protests were not limited to New York. Demonstrations erupted in other major American cities with significant African diaspora populations. The protesters were not just from Burkina Faso. They represented a cross-section of African immigrant communities, as well as African Americans who saw Traoré's struggle as part of a broader fight against Western dominance. What made these protests particularly significant was their organization and messaging. They were not random gatherings, they were coordinated events that had been planned for weeks. The protesters' message was clear. They viewed American criticism of Traoré as part of a broader pattern of Western interference in African affairs. They argued that the United States had no right to dictate to African nations how they should be governed or with whom they should approach as an ally. The response to these protests from American authorities and the broader public was swift and divided. Local law enforcement agencies, particularly in New York, found themselves in the difficult position of managing large-scale demonstrations while ensuring public safety. In Times Square, police presence was heavily increased as thousands of protesters filled the streets. While the demonstrations were largely peaceful, the large scale and intensity of the protests caught many by surprise. Store owners in the area reported disruptions to business, and some tourists found themselves unexpectedly caught in the middle of political demonstrations. The protests also sparked heated debates on social media and in mainstream media outlets. Critics argued that the demonstrations represented foreign interference in American domestic affairs, pointing out that many of the protesters were supporting a military leader who had taken power through a coup. Conservative commentators and politicians were particularly vocal in their criticism. They argued that allowing protests in support of military coups set a dangerous precedent, and that the demonstrations were anti-American in nature. Some called for investigations into the funding and organization of the protests. On the other side, supporters of the protests argued that they represented legitimate political expression and that African diaspora communities had every right to voice their opinions on American foreign policy, particularly when it affected their home countries. The situation was further complicated by the fact that many of the protesters were American citizens or legal residents who had immigrated from various African countries. This made it difficult for critics to dismiss the protests as purely foreign interference. But one of the most surprising aspects of the Traoré protest movement has been its maximum use of digital media and social media platforms. It is like a new form of political activism that has gone beyond traditional geographical boundaries. The protests did not just happen in physical spaces. They were amplified and coordinated through an extensive digital campaign. Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and Facebook became battlegrounds for narratives about African sovereignty, American foreign policy, and the legitimacy of military leadership. Supporters of Traoré have created what some observers are calling a digital cult around the young military leader. Motivational videos featuring his speeches and carefully crafted social media content have created a powerful online presence that has helped to mobilize supporters worldwide. The digital campaign has been remarkably well developed. Hashtags were coordinated across multiple platforms, viral videos were strategically released to build momentum before the physical protests, and influencers within African diaspora communities were mobilized to spread the message. But this digital activism has also sparked controversy. Some people argue that the online campaign shows signs of foreign influence, particularly from countries like Russia and China that have been building closer ties with Traoré's government. They point to the professional quality of some of the content and the coordination across multiple platforms as evidence of state-sponsored activity. However, for many supporters, the message makes sense to them, and they ask, what is not to love about Ibrahim Traoré? A young, defiant leader standing up to Western pressure should surely be an icon of resistance. The Traoré protests in the United States are not happening in isolation. They are part of a broader global movement that has significant implications for international relations and American foreign policy. The protests have highlighted the growing influence of what some observers call African populist nationalism, a movement that combines anti-colonial sentiment with support for strong leadership and true national independence. This movement has been gaining traction across Africa, particularly in countries that have experienced recent military coups or political unrest. For the United States, the protests represent a significant challenge to its traditional approach to African affairs. Historically, American policymakers have been able to work with African governments and civil society organizations to advance American interests. But the Traoré movement represents a different kind of challenge. one that has grassroots support and is clearly anti-Western in its orientation. The protests have also revealed the depth of anti-American sentiment within some African diaspora communities. While many African immigrants and their descendants have traditionally been supportive of American foreign policy, the Traore protests have shown that this support is not general, and that there are significant segments of these communities that view American actions in Africa with suspicion and hostility. The international response has been mixed. European countries, particularly France, have expressed concern about the protests and their potential impact on Western policy toward Africa. Some European officials have suggested that the protests represent a coordinated effort by hostile foreign powers to undermine Western influence in Africa. On the other hand, countries like Russia and China have been more supportive of the protests, viewing them as evidence of growing dissatisfaction with Western influence in Africa and an opportunity to advance their own interests in the region. The Traore protests have had significant economic and political ramifications that extend far beyond the streets where they took place. The demonstrations have forced American policymakers to reconsider their approach to African affairs and have highlighted the potential costs of pursuing policies that are seen as neo-colonial. From an economic perspective, the protests have drawn attention to the role of American and Western companies in Africa's extractive industries. Many of the protesters have specifically criticized American mining companies and other corporations that they argue are exploiting African resources while providing little benefit to local populations. This criticism has put pressure on American companies operating in Africa to demonstrate that their activities benefit local communities. Some companies have responded by increasing their corporate social responsibility programs and engaging more directly with local stakeholders. The protests have also had political implications within the United States. African diaspora communities represent a significant voting bloc in some key states, and their mobilization around the Traore issue has caught the attention of American politicians. Some Democratic politicians have expressed sympathy for the protesters' concerns about American foreign policy in Africa, while stopping short of endorsing Traore's military government. They have called for a more refined approach to African affairs that takes into account the concerns of diaspora communities. Republican politicians have generally been more critical of the protests, arguing that they represent a dangerous example and that the United States should not allow foreign military leaders to influence American domestic politics through their supporters. The protests have also highlighted the growing political advancement of African diaspora communities in the United States. These communities have traditionally been less politically organized than other immigrant groups, but the Traore protests have demonstrated their capacity for large-scale political mobilization. The Traore protests have raised significant security concerns for American law enforcement agencies. The scale and intensity of the demonstrations, combined with their international political implications, have forced authorities to develop new strategies for managing similar events. Local law enforcement agencies have also had to adapt their crowd control strategies to deal with the unique characteristics of these protests. Unlike traditional American political demonstrations, the Traore protests involve complex international political issues and communities that may have different cultural approaches to political expression. The Traore protests have had a profound impact on African diaspora communities across the United States. Creating both unity within these communities, the protests have brought together people from different African countries and backgrounds around a common cause. Immigrants from West Africa, East Africa, and other regions have found common ground in their opposition to what they see as Western interference in African affairs. The protests have also created a sense of political empowerment within these communities. Many participants have described feeling that their voices are finally being heard on issues that matter to them. The successful mobilization of thousands of people has demonstrated the political potential of African diaspora communities.
Yes, this is a show of solidarity with the people of Burkina Faso and their leader, Captain Traore. We're here to let them know they're not alone, right? Whatever is happening in Burkina Faso is happening everywhere, particularly in Ghana. So today's just a show of solidarity with our people in Burkina Faso. Yes, that's what happened today. Sekou Touré said something. He says, the day you find our enemies praising me, no, I betrayed you, right? There's no way your enemy would actually say anything good about you. But let's deal with the issue. Let's break it down. Let's make it very simple. America and France seem so concerned about Traore and Burkina Faso, right? The question is, what is their business in Burkina Faso? For a very long time, the French colonies in Africa, 14 of them, in fact, till date, don't have their own Ministry of Finance. They always have to keep their monies in the Ministry of Finance in France. So if Burkina Faso wants to buy anything from Ghana, they would have to write to the Finance Ministry in France for them to release the funds to Ghana. Where does this make sense? France has, if not the third, then it's the fourth largest gold reserve in the world. But France doesn't have a single active gold mine in France. So where's the gold coming from? So if today, the people through the leadership of Burkina Faso are saying they do not want France in their country any longer, how is that a bad thing? In fact, the people, not just in France and in Burkina Faso, but across the world, are standing in support of what Burkina Faso is doing. So what's the West's business in this? Let me even tell you something very interesting. When the Ghanaian president was being inaugurated on the 7th of January 2025, Captain Traoré was a guest of honor. Hear this. He was applauded even more than the president who was being sworn in Ghana. That tells you how popular he is. So our message to France and America is this: deal with your issues in America and in France. France is broke today. As of 2019, their debt to GDP was about 173%. Today is much worse. France should deal with their nonsense in France and leave Burkina Faso alone. America is in tatters today. America is well in over $3 trillion in debt. They should deal with their nonsense and leave Traoré alone. Today, look at the life of Burkina Faso in Burkina Faso today. Burkina Faso has complete and absolute ownership of all their resources, particularly gold. If nothing at all, our man has built 2 tomato factories and is actually industrializing. What has France done in Burkina Faso in the last 100 years? But again, let me speak to my African youth. You see, this is not just a Burkina Faso fight. This is an African fight. Traoré has shown us that it is possible for us to take ownership and control of our nations. This is a lesson to all of us and a message to all the African youth. It is time for us to reclaim what is rightfully ours. We are not negotiating, we are not begging, we are reclaiming. Thank you.
The media coverage of the Traoré protests has been intense and polarized, reflecting the broader political divisions surrounding the issue. Different media outlets have presented very different narratives about the protests, their significance, and their implications. Mainstream American media outlets have generally focused on the security and public order aspects of the protests. They have emphasized the disruptions to business and daily life in areas where the protests took place, and have raised concerns about foreign influence in the demonstrations. Conservative media outlets have been more critical, portraying the protest as anti-American and potentially dangerous. They have also focused on the fact that the protesters are supporting a military leader who took power through a coup, and have argued that such demonstrations have no place in American political discourse. African diaspora media outlets have been strongly supportive of the protests, presenting them as a historic moment of political awakening and resistance. These outlets have provided extensive coverage of the protests and have amplified the voices of protest organizers and participants. The American government's response to the Traoré protests has been carefully measured, reflecting the complex political and diplomatic considerations involved. Officials have had to balance respect for First Amendment rights with concerns about national security and foreign policy implications. The State Department has maintained its criticism of military coups in Africa while acknowledging the right of American citizens and residents to express their political views. Officials have emphasized that American foreign policy is based on support for democratic governance and human rights, regardless of domestic political pressure. However, the protests have forced policymakers to reconsider their approach to African affairs. The scale and intensity of the demonstrations have shown that there are significant segments of African diaspora communities that are deeply opposed to current American policies. Some officials have begun calling for a more nuanced approach that takes into account the concerns of diaspora communities while maintaining American commitment to democratic values. This has led to discussions about increasing dialogue with African diaspora communities and incorporating their perspectives into foreign policy decision-making. The protests have also highlighted the need for better intelligence and understanding of political movements within diaspora communities. The scale and coordination of the demonstrations caught many officials by surprise, suggesting that there may be gaps in understanding of these communities' political activities. Congress has begun holding hearings on American policy toward Africa, with particular focus on the role of military governments and the influence of countries like Russia and China. Some lawmakers have called for a more aggressive response to what they see as foreign interference in American domestic politics. The protests have also had implications for immigration policy. Some officials have suggested that the protests demonstrate the need for better screening of immigrants and refugees to ensure that they do not pose security risks or engage in activities that undermine American interests. Beyond their immediate political impact, the Traore protests have had significant cultural and social implications for American society. They have highlighted the growing diversity of American political discourse and the ways in which global political movements can influence domestic American politics. The protests have brought attention to the size and political potential of African diaspora communities in the United States. These communities have traditionally been less visible in American political discourse than other immigrant groups, but the protests have demonstrated their capacity for large-scale political mobilization. The demonstrations have also highlighted the ways in which American foreign policy affects immigrant communities. Many of the protesters have personal connections to countries affected by American policy, and their participation in the protests reflects their desire to influence policies that affect their home countries. The protests have sparked broader conversations about American identity and belonging. The fact that many of the protesters are American citizens or legal residents has raised questions about the relationship between American identity and loyalty to home countries. As we look to the future, the Traore protests represent a potentially significant shift in American political discussions and foreign policy. The demonstrations have shown that global political movements can have direct impacts on American domestic politics, and that diaspora communities can play important roles in shaping foreign policy debates. The protests have also highlighted the growing influence of social media and digital activism in political mobilization. The advanced use of digital platforms to coordinate and amplify the protests suggests that similar movements may emerge in the future around other international issues. For American policymakers, the protests represent both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is to maintain American interests and values while acknowledging the legitimate concerns of diaspora communities. The opportunity is to develop more inclusive and thoughtful approaches to foreign policy that take into account the perspectives of all Americans, including those with connections to other countries. The protests have also raised questions about the future of American influence in Africa. The level of opposition to American policy demonstrated by the protest suggests that traditional approaches to African affairs may be becoming less effective. This may require new strategies that are more sensitive to African perspectives and concerns. The role of countries like Russia and China in supporting or encouraging the protests also raises questions about the future of great power competition in Africa. The protests have shown that this competition is not just about governments and elites, but also about winning the support of ordinary people and diaspora communities. The Traore protests that swept across American cities represent more than just demonstrations in support of a single African leader. These protests have shown that American foreign policy can no longer be made in isolation from the communities that are affected by it. The thousands of people who took to the streets in Times Square and other American cities have made it clear that they will not remain silent when they believe that American actions are harming their home country. The long-term implications of the Traore protest are still unfolding, but they have already changed the landscape of American political discourse. They have shown that the voices of diaspora communities can no longer be ignored, and that American foreign policy must take into account the global nature of American society. Whether you support or oppose the protests, there is no denying that they represent a significant moment in American political history. They have forced Americans to confront difficult questions about foreign policy, democracy, and the relationship between American identity and global citizenship. As this story continues to develop, it will be crucial to monitor how these protests affect American policy toward Africa, how they influence other diaspora communities, and how they shape the broader conversation about America's role in the world. The Traore protests of 2025 were a turning point, a moment when Americans took to the streets for a cause rooted in Africa's fight for freedom. They disrupted cities, challenged authorities, and sparked debates, but they also inspired hope for a more just world. What do you think of this movement? Will this movement grow into a lasting force for change? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to this channel for more African stories that challenge, inspire, and connect us all.